The emergency broadcast crackled across every communication frequency in the galaxy, a desperate plea that would change everything. Ambassador Zephyr of the Kalari Confederacy stood before the assembled Galactic Council, his crystalline form trembling with fear and exhaustion. The normally composed diplomat's voice broke as he delivered news that would shake the foundations of their peaceful civilization. "The Devourers have returned," Zephyr announced, his words echoing through the vast chamber of the council station. Representatives from dozens of species sat in stunned silence, their various forms of communication falling dead quiet. The name alone carried weight that pressed down on every being present like a physical force. The Devourers were legend, nightmare stories told to young ones across the galaxy. They were the ancient enemy that had nearly consumed all life 3,000 years ago, before mysteriously vanishing beyond the galactic rim. Now they had returned with a vengeance, their biomechanical ships darker and more terrible than ever before. "Kalari Prime is gone," Zephyr continued, his voice hollow. 17 billion souls. They consumed everything. The planet itself has been stripped to its core. Our defense fleets, they lasted less than 6 hours. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives began speaking at once in dozens of languages, their panic creating a cacophony of fear. The Thrakians, proud warrior poets known for their courage, spoke of immediate evacuation to the outer rim. The peaceful Selenites, mastered diplomats who had never known war, suggested attempting communication with the Devourers. The highly advanced Nexari, builders of the galaxy's greatest technologies, proposed hiding behind energy barriers until the threat passed. Elder Counselor Marin, the ancient Vorthak who had led the council for over 2 centuries, raised her massive form to restore order. Her voice, when it came, carried the weight of authority that had guided the galaxy through countless crises. "We have faced this enemy before," she said, her deep voice resonating through the chamber. "Our ancestors fought them to a standstill and drove them back. We must do the same." But, even as she spoke, they all knew the truth. The galaxy had changed in 3,000 years. The species that had fought the Devourers to their last breath were different now. Peace and prosperity had made them soft. The warrior races had become philosophers and artists. The militant civilizations had evolved into pacifists. Even their technologies, advanced as they were, focused on creation and exploration rather than destruction. The first battle reports began streaming in as they debated. The Devourers were not the same enemy their ancestors had faced. They had grown stronger, more aggressive, more terrifyingly efficient. Their ships moved through space like living nightmares, absorbing energy from any source they encountered. Weapons fire seemed to feed them rather than harm them. Entire systems were going dark, their populations either dead or absorbed into the Devourer collective. Ambassador Kree of the Manthari stood slowly, his insectoid form clicking with anxiety. "Perhaps we should consider retreat," he suggested. "The outer galaxies are vast. We could evacuate our core worlds and establish new colonies beyond their reach." "And abandon billions to their fate?" Elder Marin's voice carried disappointment. "We are the Galactic Council. We do not abandon our people." "Then, what do you propose?" asked Representative Yala of the Scytheri, her energy form flickering with agitation. "Our combined fleets number in the hundreds of thousands, but the early reports suggest even that may not be enough. The Devourers adapt to our weapons almost instantly." The debate raged for hours. Some species offered their entire fleets to the cause, while others spoke of strategic withdrawals and defensive positions. The Nexari presented complex battle simulations that painted an increasingly grim picture. Even their most optimistic projection showed massive casualties and the loss of dozens of core worlds. As the arguments continued, a small chime indicated an incoming transmission. The main display activated, showing the communication logs from across the galaxy. Hundreds of species had responded to the emergency call, offering everything from supplies to ships to entire armies. But, as the data scrolled past, one entry caught Elder Marin's attention. "Humans," she murmured, studying the transmission details. The chamber fell quiet. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 800 years ago. They were considered a minor species, controlling just 47 systems on the galactic rim. Most council members barely knew they existed. "They're offering their entire fleet," reported Aide Controller Vex, his mechanical voice carrying a note of surprise. "Every ship, every soldier. No conditions, no territorial demands, no requests for compensation. Representative Cree made a dismissive clicking sound. Humans are a primitive species. Barely out of their home system compared to the rest of us. What could they possibly offer that our great civilizations cannot? Elder Marin accessed the human files, reviewing what little information the council had gathered about the species. They were young, aggressive, and, surprisingly adaptable. But, more interesting were the cultural reports. While most species had evolved beyond their violent past, humans seemed to maintain a troubling relationship with conflict. They were the only species in the galaxy that still maintained standing armies, still practiced warfare, still celebrated their military history. The Galactic Ethics Committee has filed 17 complaints about human aggression in the past century, noted Ambassador Zephyr, who had somewhat recovered his composure. They refuse to ban weapons from their civilian populations. Their entertainment media glorifies violence. They even have competitions where individuals fight each other for sport. Barbaric, muttered Representative Yala. No wonder they've been excluded from most council proceedings. But, Elder Marin found herself reconsidering. As the battle reports continued to arrive, each worse than the last, she began to wonder if barbarism might be exactly what they needed. The civilized galaxy was proving inadequate against the Devourer threat. Perhaps it was time to consider less civilized alternatives. What is their fleet composition? She asked. Aid Controller Vex accessed the human military database, though he had to work around significant security protocols to do so. Unusual design philosophy, he reported. Their ships are built for aggression rather than efficiency. Heavy armor, redundant systems, oversized weapons arrays. They seem to expect their vessels to take significant damage and continue fighting. Primitive engineering, scoffed the Nexary representative. Our ships are far more advanced. Yet our advanced ships are being destroyed in hours, Elder Marin observed. Perhaps there is something to be said for primitive durability. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but another transmission interrupted them. This time it was from the Outer Rim Defense Network, a collection of automated monitoring stations that watched for threats from beyond the galaxy. The message was brief but terrifying. Devourer main fleet detected. Estimated composition, 50,000 ships. Arrival at core systems projected in 14 days. 50,000 ships. The number hit the chamber like a physical blow. The entire Galactic Defense Force numbered barely 30,000 vessels, and most of those were exploration ships hastily fitted with weapons. The mathematics of the situation became brutally clear. Elder Marin made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Send a message to the humans, she commanded. Accept their offer. Full military alliance, unrestricted engagement protocols. The chamber erupted in protests. Representatives argued that humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be given unrestricted access to galactic battlefields. But, Elder Marin's mind was made up. The humans offer something none of us can, she said, her voice cutting through the arguments. They offer anger. The word hung in the air like a foreign concept. Anger was considered a primitive emotion, one that most species had evolved beyond centuries ago. It was inefficient, destructive, counterproductive. But, as Elder Marin watched the casualty reports streaming in from the front lines, she began to understand that efficiency might not be enough. The human response came within hours. Admiral Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Coalition appeared on the main screen, her appearance striking the assembled representatives as remarkably unremarkable. She was small by galactic standards, with none of the impressive physical adaptations that marked most spacefaring species. But there was something in her eyes, a cold fire that made even the eldest counselors uncomfortable. We accept the alliance, Admiral Chen said simply. Our fleets are already moving to rendezvous coordinates. We'll be ready to engage the Devourers in 6 days. Admiral Elder Marin began carefully, you should understand the nature of this enemy. They are not like anything your species has encountered. They show no mercy, accept no surrender, and seem to exist only to consume and destroy. Admiral Chan's expression didn't change. Elder Counselor, you should understand something about humans. We've been preparing for this fight our entire history. Every war we've ever fought, every weapon we've ever built, every soldier we've ever trained has been practiced for the day when something tried to destroy everything we care about. The transmission ended, leaving the council chamber in uncomfortable silence. Representatives exchanged glances, suddenly, uncertain whether they had just gained a powerful ally or unleashed something equally dangerous. Over the following days, reports began arriving about human fleet movements. Their ships were indeed primitive by galactic standards, using technologies that other species had abandoned centuries ago. But there was something unsettling about their efficiency. Human fleets moved with a coordination that suggested extensive practice in large-scale warfare. Their ships maintained formations that prioritized mutual support over individual safety. Most disturbing of all, their vessels showed clear signs of being designed specifically for fighting against superior numbers. The first contact between human and galactic forces came at the Nexus Station, a massive logistics hub near the galactic core. Human ships arrived in tight formation, their dark hulls scarred with what appeared to be previous battle damage. When Admiral Chen requested permission to board the station for strategic planning, the local commander was struck by the humans who accompanied her. They were soldiers in a way that most galactic species no longer understood. Their equipment was functional rather than elegant, their bearing alert rather than relaxed. They moved like predators, constantly scanning their environment for threats that might not exist. It was deeply unsettling for species that had known only peace for millennia. The strategic planning session revealed the true extent of the cultural divide. When Galactic Command presented their defensive strategies, focusing on preserving population centers and maintaining supply lines, the humans listened politely but seemed fundamentally uninterested. "You're planning to fight a retreating action," Admiral Chen observed. "You want to minimize losses while hoping the enemy eventually gives up and goes away." "That is the civilized approach to warfare," replied Fleet Commander Varix of the Thracians. "We protect what we can while seeking a diplomatic solution." Admiral Chen's smile was cold. "The Devourers aren't interested in diplomacy. They're interested in consumption. And they won't stop until they've consumed everything, including us." She activated a holographic display showing human tactical assessments. The plans were startlingly aggressive, focusing on offensive operations rather than defensive positions. Human strategy seemed built around the assumption that the enemy needed to be completely destroyed rather than simply repelled. "You're talking about genocide," Fleet Commander Varix said, his voice carrying shock and disapproval. "I'm talking about survival," Admiral Chen replied. "The Devourers made this choice when they decided to exterminate entire civilizations. We're just going to finish what they started." The discussion grew heated as galactic representatives struggled to comprehend human military philosophy. Concepts like acceptable losses and strategic sacrifice seemed alien to species that had spent millennia avoiding conflict. But, as battle reports continued to arrive, showing system after system falling to the Devourer advance, some began to wonder if human barbarism might be the only solution to an inhuman enemy. The real shock came when human intelligence officers presented their analysis of Devourer capabilities. While galactic scientists had spent days trying to understand how the enemy ships functioned, human military analysts had already identified weaknesses and developed countermeasures. "They're not invincible," reported Colonel Martinez, the human intelligence chief. "They adapt quickly to energy weapons, but they have trouble with kinetic attacks. Their biomechanical nature makes them vulnerable to certain toxins. And, most importantly, they seem to require constant feeding to maintain their technological edge." "How could you possibly know this?" demanded Research Director Quinn of the Nexary. "We've been studying available data for weeks without reaching these conclusions." Colonel Martinez's expression was grim. "Because we've been studying how to kill things since we learned to think. It's what we do." The blunt honesty of the statement left the chamber in uncomfortable silence. Representatives began to realize that they had invited something into their civilized galaxy that was fundamentally different from themselves. Humans weren't just another species with advanced technology and peaceful intentions. They were something far more primitive and, potentially far more dangerous. But, as the Devourers continued their advance, consuming world after world with unstoppable efficiency, the galaxy began to understand that perhaps dangerous was exactly what they needed. The first joint operation took place at the Kepler Defense Grid, a series of automated defense platforms protecting the approaches to the core systems. It would serve as humanity's introduction to galactic warfare, and the galaxy's introduction to human methods. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the HMS Retribution, her flagship and one of humanity's most advanced vessels. Around her, the combined fleet stretched across space like a metallic constellation. Galactic ships gleamed with elegant curves and energy fields, their designs optimized for efficiency and beauty. In contrast, human vessels looked like they had been built in a foundry by angry engineers. Angular, armored, and bristling with weapons, they seemed designed for one purpose: inflicting maximum damage while absorbing punishment. The tactical display showed the approaching Devourer fleet. 60 ships, each one a nightmare of biomechanical fusion that defied conventional understanding. They moved through space like living creatures, their hulls pulsing with organic rhythms while mechanical components sparked and writhed along their surfaces. Long-range scans revealed the horrifying truth about their composition: they were built from the remains of consumed civilizations, incorporating both the biological and technological components of their victims. Fleet Commander Varix of the Thracians commanded the galactic forces from his flagship, the Harmony of Stars. His tactical approach followed centuries of galactic military doctrine: establish defensive positions, minimize casualties, and seek to disable rather than destroy enemy vessels. It was a civilized approach to warfare, designed to preserve life even in conflict. All ships, assume defensive formation Beta 7, Commander Varix ordered. Priority targeting on Devourer propulsion systems. We want to disable their mobility and force a negotiated withdrawal. Admiral Chen listened to the galactic battle plan with growing frustration. She opened a private communication channel to Commander Varix. With respect, Commander, you're fighting the wrong war. These aren't rational opponents who will retreat when faced with casualties. They're predators who see your defensive posture as weakness. Admiral Chen, we must follow established protocols, Varix replied, his voice carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious concepts to a child. Galactic military doctrine has prevented major conflicts for over a millennium. We do not simply destroy opponents who can potentially be reasoned with. They consume 17 billion calories, Chen said flatly. What exactly do you think you're going to negotiate? Before Varix could respond, the Devourers opened fire. Their weapons were unlike anything in the galactic arsenal: streams of dark energy that seemed to tear holes in reality itself, followed by clouds of microscopic machines that began eating through ship hulls on contact. The elegant defensive formation of the galactic fleet became a death trap as ships found themselves unable to maneuver while under concentrated fire. The Thracian heavy cruiser Starbringer took a direct hit from what appeared to be a biological weapon. Within seconds, the ship's hull began to dissolve as alien organisms consumed the metal and converted it into more of themselves. The crew's desperate evacuation calls were cut short as the infection spread to their escape pods. All ships, break formation and engage independently, Commander Varix ordered, his calm demeanor cracking as he watched his fleet being systematically destroyed. Focus fire on the largest Devourer vessels. Negative, Admiral Chen cut in, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. All human ships, implement attack pattern Delta. All galactic ships, follow our lead or get out of the way. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations. The human fleet suddenly transformed from a collection of individual ships into a single predatory entity. Their vessels moved with synchronized precision, abandoning all pretense of defensive tactics in favor of pure aggression. The HMS Retribution led the charge, its massive kinetic cannons sending tungsten slugs the size of shuttlecraft directly into the heart of the Devourer formation. Unlike energy weapons, which the Devourers could adapt to and absorb, kinetic weapons relied on simple physics: mass times velocity equals devastation. The alien ships found themselves facing an attack they couldn't simply absorb or redirect. Behind the Retribution came the human destroyers, smaller ships that moved like pack hunters. They concentrated their fire on damaged Devourer vessels, using concentrated missile barrages to exploit weaknesses created by the heavy ships. But, most disturbing of all was their willingness to take casualties. When the destroyer HMS Defiance found itself surrounded by 3 Devourer cruisers, its captain didn't attempt to escape. Instead, he rammed his ship directly into the largest enemy vessel while detonating his remaining warheads. They're fighting like they want to die, observed Commander Varix, his voice filled with horrified fascination. They're fighting like they want to win, Admiral Chen corrected. Captain Rodriguez knew his ship was lost. So he made sure it counted for something. The battle turned into something the galaxy had never seen, a grinding, brutal slugging match where both sides seemed determined to fight until nothing remained. Human ships absorbed damage that would have crippled galactic vessels, their redundant systems and heavy armor allowing them to continue fighting even when critically damaged. When the heavy cruiser HMS Thunder lost its main engines, its crew rigged manual firing solutions and continued engaging enemy ships using only maneuvering thrusters. But it was the human response to Devourer biological weapons that truly shocked the galactic observers. When the frigate HMS Courage became infected with the same organisms that had destroyed the Starbringer, its crew didn't panic or attempt evacuation. Instead, they sealed the infected sections and continued fighting while emergency teams used flamethrowers and industrial acids to burn the infection out of their own ship. "They're using chemical weapons on their own vessel," reported Tactical Officer Zen from the Harmony of Stars, his voice filled with disbelief. "They're doing whatever it takes," Admiral Chen replied. "That's what survival looks like when the alternative is extinction." The tide of battle began to shift as human tactics proved effective against Devourer adaptations. While the alien ships could absorb and redirect energy attacks, they struggled with the sheer kinetic force of human weapons. More importantly, they seemed confused by human willingness to accept casualties in exchange for tactical advantages. The turning point came when Admiral Chen ordered a maneuver that violated every principle of galactic warfare. She directed the dreadnought HMS Vengeance to ram directly through the center of the Devourer formation, using its massive bulk and heavy armor to physically smash smaller enemy ships while its weapon systems continued firing at point-blank range. "Admiral, that maneuver will result in massive casualties," Commander Verix protested. "The Vengeance will be destroyed." "Captain Morrison knows the risks," Chen replied coldly. "He also knows that breaking their formation will allow the rest of our fleet to exploit the gap. Sometimes you have to be willing to trade a piece to win the game." The HMS Vengeance charged forward like an ancient battering ram, its hull sparking and burning as Devourer weapons concentrated on the massive ship. But human engineering proved its worth as the dreadnought's redundant systems and thick armor allowed it to absorb punishment that would have vaporized any galactic vessel. When it finally struck the center of the enemy formation, the impact was visible across the entire battlefield. 3 Devourer ships were destroyed outright by the collision. 2 more were crippled and spinning helplessly through space. The Vengeance itself was critically damaged, its hull breached in dozens of places and its engines dead. But its crew continued fighting with whatever weapons remained functional, turning their dying ship into a stationary fortress that poured fire into the confused enemy formation. Human destroyers and frigates poured through the gap created by the Vengeance's sacrifice, their weapons tearing into the disrupted Devourer ships with surgical precision. The alien vessels, adapted for fighting energy weapons and coordinated formations, found themselves helpless against the chaotic, brutal style of human warfare. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. Of the 60 Devourer ships that had attacked the Kepler defense grid, only 3 escaped to carry word of their defeat back to the main fleet. But the victory had come at a cost that shocked the galactic representatives. 17 human ships had been destroyed, with another 23 damaged beyond immediate repair. Nearly 8,000 human crew members had died in the engagement. The galactic fleet had suffered minimal losses by comparison, only 4 ships destroyed and 300 casualties. But, as they surveyed the aftermath, galactic commanders began to realize they had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. "Your people fought magnificently," Commander Verix told Admiral Chen as they met aboard the damaged HMS Retribution. "But the casualties, how do you justify losing so many lives for a single tactical victory?" Admiral Chen's expression was weary but resolute. "Commander, in the past 6 hours, the Devourers consumed 2 entire systems while we were fighting here. That's roughly 30 billion lives. Our 8,000 dead saved 30 billion living. I call that a bargain." The cold mathematics of Chen's response left Verix speechless. He began to understand that humans operated under a completely different moral framework, one where individual sacrifice was not only acceptable but expected when faced with existential threats. Over the following days, reports of the battle spread throughout the galaxy. The response was mixed and troubling. While military commanders celebrated the first significant victory against the Devourers, civilian populations reacted with horror to human casualty reports. Many species had evolved beyond the concept of acceptable losses, and the idea of deliberately sacrificing thousands of lives for tactical advantage seemed barbarically primitive. The Galactic Ethics Committee immediately filed formal protests about human combat methods. They cited the use of chemical weapons, the deliberate ramming attacks, and the apparent disregard for crew safety as violations of civilized warfare conventions. Some species began to question whether the human alliance was worth the moral compromise it represented. But other voices began to emerge as well. Scientists studying the battle data realized that human weapons and tactics had proven uniquely effective against Devourer adaptations. Military strategists noted that human willingness to accept losses had prevented a far greater catastrophe. And, most importantly, intelligence reports confirmed that the Devourer main fleet had altered course after learning of the defeat at Kepler. "They're afraid," reported xenobiologist Dr. Keth of the Selenite Research Institute. "For the first time since they returned, the Devourers have encountered an opponent that not only fought back effectively but seemed eager to continue fighting despite massive casualties. They don't know how to process that response." Admiral Chen found herself summoned before the Galactic Council to explain human military methods. The session was tense, with representatives demanding justification for what they considered excessive violence and disregard for life. "Admiral," began Elder Counselor Marin, "your tactics have proven effective against the Devourers, but many of our member species are concerned about the methods employed. How do you justify the deliberate sacrifice of your own crews?" Chen stood before the assembled council, surrounded by representatives of species that had never known true warfare. Her voice was steady but carried an edge that made many uncomfortable. "Counselors, you spent the last millennium believing that civilization means the absence of violence. You've convinced yourselves that rational beings will always choose negotiation over conflict, compromise over victory. But the Devourers aren't rational beings. They're a force of nature, like a plague or a natural disaster. You don't negotiate with a hurricane. You either survive it or you don't." "But surely there must be alternatives to such extreme measures," protested Representative Yala. "The loss of life you've suffered would be considered a catastrophe by our standards." "By your standards, the loss of entire civilizations is also a catastrophe," Chen replied. "Yet you were prepared to accept exactly that outcome rather than fight effectively. Every species in this galaxy has forgotten something that humans remember. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent life is to be willing to sacrifice your own." The debate continued for hours, but it was interrupted by an urgent transmission from the front lines. The Devourer main fleet had finally reached the core systems and was beginning its assault on the industrial worlds that powered galactic civilization. Early reports suggested that the enemy force was even larger than initially estimated, over 80,000 ships, including massive biomechanical constructs the size of small moons. As the Council watched the initial battle reports in growing horror, they began to understand that philosophical debates about acceptable casualties were a luxury they could no longer afford. The Devourers had demonstrated their own complete disregard for galactic civilization. Now the question was whether the galaxy was willing to become as ruthless as necessary to survive. The Forge worlds burned. 7 massive industrial planets that had powered galactic civilization for over 2,000 years were now dying under the relentless assault of the Devourer main fleet. From the bridge of the HMS Retribution, Admiral Chen watched the tactical display with growing frustration as galactic forces attempted to defend the vital manufacturing centers using traditional defensive strategies. The results were predictable and devastating. Galactic ships, no matter how advanced their technology, simply couldn't match the raw destructive power and adaptability of the Devourer swarms. The beautiful formations and elegant tactics that had defined galactic warfare for millennia proved worse than useless against an enemy that seemed to exist solely to consume and destroy. "Admiral," reported Commander Sarah Torres, Chen's tactical officer, "galactic fleet casualties are approaching 60%. They're requesting immediate human reinforcement at Forge World Prime." Chen studied the battle data streaming in from across the system. The situation was beyond critical. Forge World Prime contained the manufacturing facilities that produced nearly 30% of the galaxy's advanced technology. Its loss would cripple any hope of mounting an effective long-term defense against the Devourers. But the human fleet was already stretched thin. 3 major engagements in the past week had reduced human forces to barely 40% of their original strength. Every ship, every crew member, every weapon system was desperately needed. Committing their remaining forces to defend Forge World Prime would leave dozens of other systems completely vulnerable. "Ma'am," Torres continued quietly, "Fleet Command is recommending strategic withdrawal. We could preserve our remaining forces and establish a defensive perimeter around the core worlds." It was the rational choice. The civilized choice. The choice that every galactic military commander would make without hesitation. It was also the choice that would hand the galaxy to the Devourers on a silver platter. "Negative," Chen said firmly. "Signal all human vessels. We're going in." "Admiral, with respect, the mathematics are impossible," protested Captain Williams, her strategic planning officer. "We're facing odds of nearly 15 to 1. Even with our tactical advantages, we can't possibly hold against those numbers. Chen turned to face her senior staff, and they saw something in her eyes that went beyond mere determination. It was a cold fury that seemed to burn without consuming itself, a rage so pure and focused that it had become something else entirely: purpose. "Captain Williams, you're thinking like a galactic officer," she said. "You're trying to find a way to win without losing. But sometimes there is no victory without sacrifice. Sometimes the only way to save everything is to risk everything." The human fleet moved toward Forge World Prime with a coordination that had been perfected through centuries of human warfare. But this time was different. Chen wasn't just deploying her ships for another tactical engagement. She was implementing a strategy so radical, so fundamentally opposed to galactic thinking, that it would either save civilization or destroy the human fleet entirely. The plan was elegantly simple in its brutality. Instead of attempting to defend the Forge worlds directly, human forces would allow the Devourers to commit fully to their assault on the industrial planets. Then, while the enemy was focused on consumption and vulnerable to counterattack, the human fleet would strike at the heart of the Devourer formation with everything they had. It was a strategy that required perfect timing, complete surprise, and the willingness to watch billions die while positioning for a decisive strike. No galactic species would have even considered such an approach. But humans had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to save lives was to be willing to watch them be lost. The HMS Retribution led a strike force of 23 ships toward the outer edge of the Devourer fleet. They moved dark and silent, using advanced stealth systems borrowed from human intelligence services rather than military sources. These were technologies developed for assassination and sabotage rather than honorable warfare, tools that galactic civilization had never thought to apply to military operations. As they approached the enemy formation, the full scope of Devourer capabilities became apparent. The alien ships weren't just consuming the industrial facilities on the Forge worlds, they were growing larger and more powerful with every passing hour. Massive biomechanical constructs pulsed with stolen energy, incorporating the advanced technologies they devoured into their own increasingly nightmarish forms. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Commander Park from her position at the sensor station. "They're not just destroying the Forge worlds. They're turning them into more ships." Chen studied the sensor readings with clinical detachment. The Devourers had indeed found a way to convert consumed matter directly into additional fleet units. What had begun as an 80,000 ship invasion force was now approaching 90,000 vessels, with numbers increasing by the hour. "Admiral," reported Communications Officer Reyes, "we're receiving a transmission from Fleet Commander Varix. Galactic forces are requesting permission to withdraw from Forge World Prime. Casualties are approaching total fleet destruction." The transmission came through on the main screen, showing Varix on the bridge of his heavily damaged flagship. The proud Thrakian looked like he had aged decades in the past few hours, his normally confident bearing replaced by barely controlled desperation. "Admiral Chen," he said, his voice heavy with defeat, "we cannot hold. Our ships are being destroyed faster than we can count them. I must request immediate withdrawal of all forces to preserve what remains of our fleet." Chen's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Commander Varix, I understand your situation. But I need you to hold position for another 2 hours." "Admiral, in 2 hours there will be no galactic fleet left to preserve," Varix replied, his voice carrying the weight of watching his people die. "I will not sacrifice my remaining ships for a hopeless cause." "It's not hopeless if it serves a purpose," Chen said coldly. "Your ships are not being sacrificed, Commander. They're being invested. In exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, you're going to understand what I mean." The transmission ended, leaving Varix staring at a blank screen in confusion and growing anger. But Chen had no time to explain tactical nuances to officers who still thought of war as a civilized endeavor. She had a trap to spring. The human strike force reached their designated positions just as the Devourer fleet achieved maximum commitment to their assault on Forge World Prime. Massive biomechanical ships had descended into the planet's atmosphere, their feeding appendages tearing through industrial complexes like hungry beasts. They were vulnerable in a way they had never been before, focused entirely on consumption rather than combat. "All ships, weapons free," Chen ordered. "Target priority is the largest vessels first. We're not trying to save ammunition." What followed was perhaps the most devastating surprise attack in galactic history. Human ships appeared from stealth positions throughout the Devourer rear guard, their weapons already locked onto critical targets. Kinetic cannons that had been charged for hours released their fury in perfectly coordinated volleys. Nuclear missiles, armed with warheads that had been specifically designed to disrupt biomechanical interfaces, struck with surgical precision. The massive devourer ships that had been consuming Forge World Prime suddenly found themselves under attack from an enemy they couldn't see or immediately locate. Their adaptive defenses, focused on dealing with galactic energy weapons, were completely unprepared for the raw kinetic force of human attacks. But Chen's true masterstroke wasn't the surprise attack itself. It was what happened next. As the Devourer fleet reacted to the human assault, turning their massive formations to deal with this new threat, they exposed their flanks to the surviving galactic forces they had been pursuing. For the first time in the entire war, Devourer ships found themselves caught between two enemies, unable to concentrate their adaptive defenses in a single direction. Fleet Commander Varix, watching from his crippled flagship, suddenly understood what Chen had meant about investment and purpose. The human admiral had used the galactic fleet as bait, allowing them to absorb massive casualties in order to position the Devourers for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. All ships, Varix ordered, his voice suddenly filled with new determination, follow Admiral Chen's lead. Concentrate fire on enemy vessels already engaged with human forces. The battle became a nightmare of coordinated destruction as human and galactic forces worked together for the first time as a truly unified fleet. Human ships provided the raw firepower and tactical aggression, while galactic vessels contributed their superior shielding and precision targeting systems. The combination proved more effective than either force could have achieved independently. But the cost was staggering. Human ships, designed to absorb punishment and continue fighting, were being destroyed at an alarming rate. The HMS Challenger.